Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of The Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and today I am thrilled to welcome the national correspondent for the Jewish Insider, Gabby Deutch. Gabby, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
Well, we have a lot to cover, but I want to start by going back with you a little bit and your upbringing. So you were born in Cleveland and then moved to Florida. So how old were you when you moved?
That's right. I was 3 years old, so it's not something I remember. But my mom's whole family is from Ohio, so I like to say that I'm a Midwesterner at heart, and that people are nice there, and they're not always nice in Florida.
Well, it depends where in Florida. So I'm from New York, so I compare it. It's a lot nicer here than people there. So it's all relative, I guess. So you don't remember anything. So you weren't upset or anything when you moved.
I mean, maybe I was, but not in a way that that I remember. I mean, we used to go back every summer when I was growing up. My grandparents were in Canton, Ohio, which is where the Football Hall of Fame is, and
Fine.
not much else. So I remember all of that.
So how was your family with regard to Judaism? I mean, were you observant at all growing up?
I would say we're strongly, proudly conservative Jews, and not the political conservative. So I went to public school my whole life, but I went to sleepaway camp at Camp Ramah from the time I was 9 years old. So we were always very connected. And when I was a kid, we went to Shabbat services a lot. We did
But
Shabbat dinner every week at home. And so it was always a huge part of my life.
yeah, we always had Shabbat growing up as well. You couldn't do anything until Shabbat meal was over, and then you could do other things.
Exactly, exactly.
So for those who don't know, so your dad, Ted Deutch, a former congressman. So how did that impact you growing up? Was it rough or was it exciting? Because I could see it bringing a whole lot of scrutiny to a family, I guess. But you could see it as a pride when people were like, lauding him and loving him, and anger when you see people attacking him. So how was it for you?
It was definitely exciting, and there were a lot of really amazing opportunities that came with it. He first ran for office when I was 10 years old,
Hmm.
for state senate in Florida. And so really from the time I was a kid, that was my life. And in that first election, um, there were a lot of events with the snowbirds, the retirees in South Florida. So having cute kids with you
It
definitely
helped.
helped make the case. And then I was 14 when he was elected to Congress. And um, so I think there were definitely challenges, but mostly it was something that we always thought was very cool. We got to go to Washington and meet interesting people.
That's
Uh,
fine. So do you remember your feelings as a kid? I mean, when your dad comes out and say, "Hey, I'm going to be running," how was that?
it's a good question. That's something that I don't really think I've been asked, and I think I don't really remember. I think when you're a kid, you don't really know what to think about change, but you also don't really think you have any power in it. So I think probably he said it, and I was like,
Okay.
okay. And I would imagine there were conversations with the family, but um, I think that probably my siblings and I were along for the ride.
Now, I'm just curious for the second part of that is did you ever experience like as a kid like someone criticizing and you getting like so angry like don't say that about my dad?
There's one story that comes to mind when I was in high school. I don't remember the specifics, but some guy in one of my classes just said to me out of the blue, he was like, "My dad didn't vote for your dad." I'm like,
Oh,
okay.
well, that showed
And
you. Yes.
right. So I was annoyed by it, but I didn't really have anything to say back to it.
Right.
But I think that was pretty unusual. I mean, my dad was a Democrat, and we lived in a place where most of the people that we were
Hmm.
around and knew also were. So it was not that wasn't something that was sort of coming into
Right.
my life very much.
When did you first start showing an interest in writing?
Well, I I think I started being interested in writing when I was in college. And now as I look back and I think, was there any kind of thread earlier that brought me here? I was always the kid who was sitting and like at the kitchen counter reading my parents' newspapers. Um, from the time that I was young, they used to get many print newspapers. But I didn't do a lot of writing growing up. In school. It wasn't a thing that I thought much about. I didn't
Mhm.
know people who were journalists. None of my parents' friends worked in journalism. And then I went to college and uh, I had always been interested in politics growing up in the family that I was in. And I think as I was figuring things out in college and trying out different kinds of activities, I got involved with a political magazine and I started realizing that I liked writing about politics more than sort of being in the mix myself and
Participating.
getting to talk to different kinds of people. And so that's when I first started writing and then took some writing classes in college, and it's just something that clicked for me.
Did you remember what the first thing you wrote was?
Well, the first writing class that I took in college was my freshman year. It was a nonfiction writing class where you wrote
Mhm.
personal essays, and it actually was probably my worst class in college. And I was very discouraged, but I really liked it. But I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Maybe this isn't for me. And um, I remember, I think the first thing that I wrote in that class was something about a trip I had taken to Poland to learn about the Holocaust. And
Mhm.
I wrote it in the most over the top kind of way possible with, 20 million adjectives and very much the opposite of show, don't tell. And so I learned some important lessons from that. I recently found that essay. I don't know why I was looking for it, but I found that essay and not so fun to read looking back on it.
Oh, you just recently saw the first thing that you wrote?
Yeah, this is so boring, but I was clearing out some folders on my computer. I had to make space, and I found everything from the place where I had all of my college papers.
Well, even even books that I've had published now, I look at them like, oh, why did I do that? So I get that. Things were already in print and like, oh my gosh, I wish I could have changed this a little bit. So I totally get that.
Right, or you look back, at least for me, I'll
Yeah.
look back on an article I wrote like 4 or 5 years ago and think, how did I know all of this? Like, I'll read it and I will feel like I'm learning all this stuff, and I'm like, I was the person who wrote that. What happened between then and now?
Well, you presently write for the Jewish Insider. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What it is and what some of the things that you do for them are.
Sure. So, Jewish Insider, we're a Jewish news site focused primarily on politics and the way that issues that folks in the Jewish community care about play out within the political process. And so I'll talk more about what I do in a minute, but the main way that we reach people, we have a morning newsletter that we send out. It's called the
Mhm.
Daily Kickoff. I would recommend it.
I get
And we
it.
try to be the we try to be the place where people who are trying to get a sense of what is the Jewish community talking about can come. So
Mhm.
that's a mix of um, analysis and kind of witty takes on what's happening in the news, reporting on what's happening in Washington and in politics, gathering the best essays and other writing on Jewish topics from other publications. And so we try to be the one-stop shop for people at the start of their day. And I am a reporter, and uh, my beat, broadly speaking, is kind of Israel, anti-Semitism, Jewish community. Those are very big things. So since October 7th in particular, I've spent a lot of time reporting on the White House and the Biden administration and the ways that they have handled the war in Israel and Gaza. And also last year did a lot of coverage of the presidential campaign and how all of these
Mhm.
issues were playing out. And then I also write a lot about the impact of all of this on the Jewish community. So anti-Semitism, places where Jews are facing litmus tests over their beliefs, um, in all kinds of fields and communities, and the way that that's affecting being Jewish in America.
Yeah, I'm going to bring that up definitely. And well, that's a good segue right now because you went to Yale, so you wrote for their paper there. When you look around and see what's going on in the college campuses, particularly Ivy League ones, So what goes through your mind? Because you went to one of those schools where some of these things are happening now.
It's a great question. And whenever I talk about it, it makes me feel really old, in the sense that I graduated college in 2018. So that's almost 7 years ago in the scheme of life. Not that long. Uh, but when you look at what's happening now,
Yeah.
it feels in many ways like an entirely different place. When I was in college, I guess for no apparent reason, I was blessed by there not being any major conflicts in the Middle East. So things were quiet with Israel. There was no, the activism we're seeing now, it just wasn't existing. And I don't know if that's because things were different or because it was just calm. But I think when I look at what's happening now on campuses, I think so much of it is driven by social media in a way that even a few years ago when I was in school, we didn't have to deal with.
Right.
So, just as an example, and I was actually just talking to someone who is an undergrad at Yale now, on Instagram, people can share any post to their
Right.
story, and that goes away after 24 hours. So, people feel the need to share, basically make their political leanings clear by sharing something to their story, to sort of weigh in and communicate to their followers, don't worry, I care about this, even if they're not actually doing anything about it, sort of the
The virtue
pinnacle of
signaling.
virtue
Right.
signaling.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so now you have students who, anytime they're talking to someone, they might have in the back of their head, oh, you just posted something to your Instagram that was basically making fun of the hostages in Gaza. And then now you know that that person has that view. So it affects the ways that people engage with each other. Like these sort of, that's just the culture of the way people speak to each other on campus and the way people relate to each other. There's a lot more just skepticism. There's a lot more, I think, thinking about your words. And I think in a lot of ways, I don't want to say it's surprising overall. What is surprising to me, and maybe this is naive, but certainly not surprising anymore, but it was after October 7th, was how quickly so many groups of really smart people started sharing basically Israel deserved this.
Right.
This was their fault because I don't like the way Israel treats the Palestinians. And how quickly that took over social media. It really did surprise me.
Well, it's a lot of social media driven, like you just said, and you think that social media is probably the number one reason for all this, like the rise in anti-Semitism in schools and things.
It's a good question. Is it the reason or is it a symptom? I think it's hard to say. Um, I think it's the certainly the reason for it being so widespread because before you might have certain campus groups meeting about this, but they don't really have a way to get out their message,
Hmm.
and most people aren't engaging with it. And now it's in front of everyone all the time.
Right.
And even smart people. I mean, I was talking to someone I know who is a student at Harvard, and this was in the fall of 2023, so not long after October 7th. And she told me she was on a walk with a friend and they were going to get coffee. And she said, do you want to go to Starbucks? And the friend said, no, we can't go to Starbucks. They support genocide. And this girl that I know said, what do you mean? And her friend said, well, they support Israel or something vague. And she had no idea what she was actually talking about and the reason that she is like supposed to hate Starbucks.
Right.
And so I think, yeah, I think it's fair to say that social media plays a huge role in it and that even the smartest kids, or in theory, the smartest kids, often are seeing posts without context and don't have the reflex to say, wait a second, is this
Right.
true?
Right.
Should I learn more about it?
No, you're 100% right there. I interviewed on the rapper, Kosher Dills. So he does a series of interviews with people at these protests, and you have to see the videos. A lot of them don't have no idea why they're there. They don't know anything. They just know this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and they don't know any of the reasoning behind it. It's unbelievable to see to watch these things.
Well, I think people want to feel part of something.
Hmm.
Um, when I was in college, the big issue on Yale's campus was renaming some of the dorms,
Right.
essentially. There was one that had been named after a very, very prominent slave owner. That was the big thing that was bringing people out to protest. And when you're in college and you're in such close proximity to everyone and you're learning about these issues often for the first time and people care deeply, which is important and I respect, but you want to do something with that. And if you see so many people who are saying, this is important, you're on the wrong side of history if you support Israel, I think a lot of people, they're not really interested in doing their own research to try and
Basically.
figure out, and they don't want to seem like bad guys. Like they don't want to lose their friends. There's a huge social component to all of it.
You do a lot of stories. I did a lot of research on you this past couple of weeks. So you do a lot of stories about impacting the nation, like we just talked about. You did one on the exclusion of Jews in a major LGBTQ event. A couple of years ago, you covered a story in which included me as well about anti-Semitism in the Kidlit field, which has only grown significantly since the story that you did. So, how do you see things in the world of journalism? I'm curious. So, is it something that you see in your field as well that happening about exclusion of Jews or rising anti-Semitism?
Well, I think the most famous case of this, if you will, was Barry Weiss,
Hmm.
famously resigning from the New York Times, I think 4 or 5 years ago at this point, and saying basically as a big part of her reason, she wrote often about Israel and issues of concern to the Jewish community, and she felt like it made her a pariah among her
Right.
colleagues. And so I think that there is a lot of that that's probably happening below the surface. Um, I haven't looked at it in the same way in the media world that I have in some of these other professions, so it's a good question. But certainly when you look at the kinds of stories that we're seeing from a lot of publications that I like and respect and pay money to, the way that they cover not just the war in the Middle East, but also what's happening here.
Right.
And there's so often a bias and not just an anti-Israel bias, because I'm hesitant to say, oh, all of mainstream media is biased against Israel. I don't think it's true, and I don't think it's productive to say that. But you often see reports that might go to a really extreme segment of the Jewish community that doesn't represent where most Jews are, and try to say, well, basically, this is the good Jew. This is who we're going to quote. We're going to listen to their story instead of trying to find someone who's more representative. And there's just a lack of understanding often about so much of the history here. And in some ways, that's fair. Journalists have to cover lots of things. The news is fast moving. It's not the fault of the media industry that October 7th happened and most reporters were not experts in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But when you're reading a lot of the reporting, often there are basic facts that are missed that, a simple Google, if you would have spent an
Right.
extra 15 minutes researching it, probably would have answered for you. So I have been very frustrated with a lot of the coverage that I've seen, but I don't know that I'm willing to say that there is widespread anti-Semitism or exclusion of Jews in the field. That said, there are places for sure where that is happening.
Well, that leads to my next question. You might not say it, but I think most people that I look at it, places that are called out all the time, the New York Times, BBC, Washington Post, is you'd be hard pressed to find a story that supports anything, on Israel. And they even like very excusatory, I guess, for the, Hamas protests, you know, downplaying what happens to Jewish students. So, like when you see that, because you work for a Jewish organization, a Jewish newspaper, but so you may not see a lot of the same things. But I don't see the news being reported objectively when it comes to Jewish or Israel issues. So this is kind of a continuation of the previous thing. So, with regard to the state of journalism, so I took journalism in school. You're a journalist, not to say, but I was always taught to report objectively and not insert yourself into the story. So, but I do see a lot of that now. So how difficult is that for you? Like, I guess, to maintain not to put your own beliefs in a story, I guess.
You're right that when you're learning about becoming a journalist, you're you're entering the field of objectivity in journalism. And if you look at all of the major media outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they will still say that that is their North Star. But I think something that I've often asked myself this, and maybe I think among the younger generation of reporters, there's a skepticism of the idea that objectivity is possible. And some people say that because they think we have to take a political perspective. There's plenty of journalists on the left who think, for example, when we cover Trump, we have to say that he's bad. But for me, when I'm thinking about objectivity, it's not that it's not that I'm trying to take a side one
Mm.
way or the other, but anytime you're a journalist and you're writing an article, you have to choose which voices you're going to feature. You have to choose the way you lay out your article, which story will go at the top.
Right.
That's the part people are going to read the most. So that's essentially whose story do you think is most important? How do you lay it out? And I'm not saying that because I think we need to try and change it, but I think that there does need to be there's certain power that we have in writing these stories. And so there's an obligation, I think, to try and find a wide range of voices, to try and lay these stories out fairly. So for me, I don't need the Washington Post to be pro-Israel, but I need there to be either there or at any other paper just due diligence on these stories and a skepticism toward, for instance, claims coming from Hamas or people who are aligned with Hamas, and not to treat Hamas as equal to Israel because they're a terrorist
Right.
group. And um, I think a lot of journalists who are writing about all of this are coming at it with everyone has their own biases, and I think if we try to deny that as journalists and say we're just objective, we report the facts, I think we're all lying to ourselves a little bit. Um, I think that instead we should be saying, okay, here's how I feel, but let me put that aside and try and just tell the story in the most truthful way
Mhm.
possible. And it's easier said than done, and there are deadlines. And sometimes, if you're trying to have it be balanced, the person you need to help you do that doesn't call you back. But a lot of times, I read stories and I don't feel that any attempt was made at
Oh,
balance.
yeah, that's what I feel the same way. I always look like, and you know, kind of where they're going to be coming from, or who the sources are. That is, you what opinion you're going to get before you even read the article. So, how do you feel is the state of journalism today in general? I guess it's you said when you graduated, and it's not that long since you graduated, but it's already so different from when you did graduate and now, because now there are so many people who seek news from online sources, from like, just independent journalism. You mentioned Barry Weiss, who also has like an independent one as well. And so they, instead of getting the news from the mainstream media, so how do you see the role, journalism today as far as overall, and just what's the state of it, as is it still a viable, you know, attention, place to get, information from?
I think one of the biggest trends that we have seen in recent years is people getting their news from more and more siloed places. So, just as an example, Jewish Insider, obviously, we're a niche publication. We're not trying to reach every single person in America. We would be glad if every person in America read what we were doing, but we have a specific subset of readers and we know what our audience is. And so we do a good job at trying to reach them. And we have our newsletter and we're sort of operating in that particular audience. And then you see that those are the kinds of media companies that are doing very well, places that have a really particular audience or a niche that they're covering, and they're able to reach those people directly. So that's something that's growing a lot. Or on the other end of the spectrum, the New York Times, which is becoming, sort of a one-stop shop for many people of news and games and cooking and all of these other things. But in terms of the level kind of just below that, local and regional papers, places that have been a huge lifeline. Yeah, it's a really hard time for journalists, for journalism as well. Um, and you also have with social media, politicians who once would have needed to go to a media outlet to get their story out can now
Right.
just do it themselves. Or like you said, independent journalists journalists, some being closer to that term than others, going on TikTok and posting videos with the news that they often take from actual news
Mainstream.
outlets, but put in their own videos and get the credit for. So I think it's challenging. I believe, and maybe I'm biased because I'm a journalist, but I do believe that there will always be a need for journalism because people need to know what's going on. We saw it with the wildfires in LA, and anytime you have, unfortunately, some kind of disaster like that, people are going to trusted sources. They're going to
Mhm.
the LA Times or they're turning on the local news, and they're not necessarily going on TikTok to get their instructions about should I evacuate or what's happening right now. But the question is, just because there's that need, are people paying for it? Are they interested? Are they reading it? And I think there's a lot of changes in readers' habits, and it's really hard to capture people's attention when a lot of times they
There's so
just want
many.
to scroll videos.
So
As
I
someone
just
who
want,
also
yeah,
scrolls on videos sometimes, and
yeah,
I understand.
no, I do too, but it's just, it's, I look at it, you can just go on Twitter any single day, go on TikTok, like you said, and there are so many, different independent journalists giving out information that, it's mind-boggling to see so many different sources, and that sometimes, like you mentioned, that takes away from, what the actual journalists are doing. And it's tough. I was just wondering if there was something that, is that something that journalists are doing in general, like, the big papers or the big news sources that can bring people back? Is it a matter of trust now, a little bit?
Well, I think that, God willing, there will be things that media outlets can do to bring readers back. I think some of it is trust for sure, and um, whether for politics or other reasons, having lost people to think that they've gone too far in one direction or the
Right.
other. Um, but I think there's just changes in the way that people are consuming the
So,
news. So are we ever going to go back to the way that it was 20 years ago when everyone got their local paper every morning and sat down and read it over breakfast? Absolutely
that's
not. And anyone who's trying to do that is, I think, misguided. But are there, we know that people are interested in what's happening in their
right.
communities. So the question becomes, how do we get them news about their area? There are some really interesting local news startups that are happening, for example, and um, newsletters are something where, again, there continues to be a lot of interest. So I think that people are interested in the information, but one of the problems then is if everyone's reading a different news source, like, okay, the thing I care most about, for example, is reading about Jewish news. So I get the Jewish Insider email, and that's
Mhm.
kind of my news. That's great, but what about your friend who the thing they care most about is crypto, and that's the main newsletter they read every day? People are not necessarily getting all of the same information.
I just want to shift gears for a little. While researching you, one of the main things that pops up immediately, something that I had no idea about, the murder of Rabbi Rabinowitz. So it happened over 40 years ago. Like I said, I knew nothing about this. And it's such a fascinating story. And you wrote a whole big thing on it. So no one was ever arrested. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. I'll share the brief background on the story, which is 2 years ago, I wrote a five-part series about the unsolved murder of Rabbi Philip Rabinowitz, who was a rabbi in Washington, D.C. at Kesher, Israel, which is an Orthodox
Not
synagogue
just
in
saying this, but great
Georgetown.
job and fascinating reading on all your things that you did. But go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you.
No.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. But he had been the rabbi at this very prominent synagogue in Georgetown for a really long time. It was the only Orthodox synagogue. So if you were an observant Jew and you were in Washington, that was where you went. So there have been cabinet secretaries, senators, diplomats, all kinds of important people have gone to the synagogue over the years. And there was a longtime rabbi, Rabbi Rabinowitz, who was there for 25, no, I think 35 years actually, until 1984 when he was murdered in his home. And the case was never solved. It came to my attention because a colleague of mine goes to that synagogue and he had been there for a Saturday morning service a few years ago, and we were just talking, and he mentioned to me, "Have you ever heard of this guy?" And I started Googling, and I hadn't. And we said, we have to do a story about this because to think now, if there were a really prominent rabbi in a major city who was killed, God forbid, in his home, and to think that basically people just kind of went back to their daily life
Right.
afterward, and um, the person was never found. If that happened now, it would be a huge deal, and it was a huge deal at the time. But I was surprised as someone who used to live in Washington that I had never even heard of this
Right.
case. So I started looking into it and ended up writing the story, looking at what might have happened to him, his family's background, which is its own fascinating story, and ultimately pieced together. And I would recommend to anyone to read the story because it's so much more than just a whodunit. It's what's his role in this place? What does it say about this really important community, crime in Washington, the Jewish community? But there are all of these theories about this one person at the synagogue who the rabbi was believed to have helped, a homeless man who was essentially living in the synagogue. And there's this theory among many people there that he was the person who killed him, who killed the rabbi. And in some ways, a lot of the evidence does point to that. He would go to the rabbi's house to talk with him, um, but no one was ever arrested. And there was a good amount of evidence that was never found. Plus, this was before DNA testing, and um, a lot of the material from the case was likely ruined in a flood in,
Oh,
in the
mhm.
DC police lab several years ago. So there's not even necessarily a way to look at it again. Um, and so I examined those theories and basically said, you know, what does it mean that everyone from the community kind of landed on this guy when no one actually knows if he did it? How does a community like that go back to life, really, after their spiritual leader is lost? But it was just I got to talk to a ton of really interesting people and learn a lot about a city that I love.
So why was the case just ultimately dropped? So there's no one's going to pick it back up again?
Yeah, the police, I mean, they worked on it, of course, at the time, and there were police investigators who were talking to the leaders of the synagogue and keeping them informed. And as I understand it, they worked on it for about a year. And they hadn't really made progress. And at a certain point, I think things kind of fell by the wayside. And that's when murder really started to spike in Washington, D.C., not long
Hmm.
after that. And there were other
Of
things
other
coming
things.
before them, but it basically just didn't go anywhere. And when I talked to the police, they told me that the case was still open. This was 40 years ago, and they said we can't tell you anything because it's an open case technically. So I filed a Freedom of Information lawsuit against them actually, and they sent me back one document, which was a press release from the day of the murder. So I didn't
No,
get too much from them.
no, I mean, I was in New York at the time that happened. And like I said, I had never heard of it. And it's just such a fascinating case. And I was reading that people still think that the murderer is there at, by the shul, actually. So it's just incredible. It's that this was never done. I hope something is done about it. So what advice, you know, that a successful journalist, what advice could you give someone that's looking to get into that field?
I remember really distinctly when I was in college and when I had just graduated and looking for things to do in journalism, that there were a lot of people who were coming to me, like senior people in the field, when I would ask them for advice, and they would say, well, basically, you have to do X, Y, and Z. And they would just tell me exactly the things that they did to get to their job. So I had one person tell me, well, you've got to go work for a small local paper, and then you'll get go to a bigger local paper and then you'll come to Washington or New York for a big job. But those aren't those kinds of paths in journalism. So much has changed, aren't really possible anymore. So I think the first thing I would say is anyone who tells you they know exactly what you should do is wrong. Uh, and I think the main thing is try to spend time, especially if you're still in school, talking to different journalists, thinking about, do you like to write? Do you want to work in TV? Do you want to work on the radio? And try and talk to people who work in those different fields. Send people cold messages on LinkedIn. People like to talk about themselves, and so if you ask them to, they often say yes. And I think
I got a few
one piece of it,
interviewees for this podcast to LinkedIn, actually, but yes, you're right.
yeah, yeah, and the one maybe more useful piece of advice I would give is it's easy when you are starting to think about what your dream job is, right? Let's say, want to be a staff writer at the New Yorker and write 30,000 word articles, or I want to be a host on CNN, or anything in between. Um, but that's not the thing you're going to do when you're 23. And so to think about the thing that you're interested in and how you can get there, and I'll just say for me, I had not necessarily anticipated working in Jewish media, which
Mhm.
is ironic because I care so deeply about the Jewish community. Not that I didn't want to, it just wasn't something I had thought much about. And then I met my current boss at a conference and we struck up a relationship and stayed in touch. And it presented me opportunities to write. And then ultimately, I got this job full time with Jewish Insider. And so I would just say be open to different kinds of things. And in my job, I get to do the thing that I love, which is talking to interesting people and then telling stories, and writing, which I also love. And um, I don't think I would have said when I was in college that it was necessarily this outlet that I was going to be at, but just to be open to different kinds of opportunities and doing the things that you actually want to do. And I think for anything, if you care about it and do a good job at it and are ambitious, then it'll at least give you options for the future or get you to talk to interesting people.
Advice. Now, what's next for you? What do we have to look forward to from you coming up next?
It's a good question. I've been doing a lot of political work lately, especially throughout the campaign, and I had been covering the Biden administration. So right now, this week has been crazy with Biden's last week, plus the hostage and ceasefire deal that's happening, and covering breaking news about that. But I have a couple of investigations that I am working on as well for Jewish Insider, and I think looking at after if this deal goes through and things calm down in Gaza and in Israel, what's the next step for the Jewish community? What does that mean politically here in the US? And those are just some big questions that I'm starting to think about.
Oh, when that comes out, love to have you back and discuss all that stuff as well. So how can people follow you on social media?
I'm on Twitter or X. My username on there is at @GSDeutsch. And I would recommend all of your listeners to subscribe to our morning newsletter at Jewish Insider, which you can do at jewishinsider.com. We're easy to find.
Gabby, thank you so much for taking the time today. Very gracious of you, and like I'm a fan of yours. And ever since you did that piece on Kidlit, you do a lot for the Jewish community in general. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm glad that we've been able to stay in touch.
Yes, thanks. Well, again, this has been the Jewish Lens. I'm Jonathan Rosen, and again, a very special thanks to Gabby Deutch. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to the Jewish Lens, where all items used was strictly kosher.